a second, but there are some headlines out there talking about how this could be the largest IPO ever. So, based on the financial disclosures in this S1, how large of an IPO is SpaceX targeting, and would it actually be the largest IPO ever?
Yeah. Um, so interestingly enough, there are going to be a number of amendments to this document, and one of the questions that sort of still remains is, how many shares they're going to sell and at what valuation. Sort of the reporting that's out there is that, they are looking to raise in the ballpark of 75 billion dollars at a valuation of as much as $2 trillion. And I think the biggest IPO of all time was Saudi Aramco, and they only raised about, $25 billion or so. So they've got some wiggle room there, even if they don't end up raising the full 75 billion or more. It seems, pretty certain it's going to be the largest IPO of all time.
Now, you mentioned just a few minutes ago the amount of debt that SpaceX reported, and our colleague Alan Onsman, in some discussion, pointed out that the number of risk factors in this prospectus go also for many pages. And there's a quote that says, in part, our substantial level of indebtedness could materially adversely affect our financial condition. So, what do you think is most important to understand about the debt that SpaceX is carrying, and what does that do, if anything, to Musk and his wealth?
Yeah, so they've got, I think, around $29 billion of debt. So it is a lot of debt for a company that, is only doing $19 billion or so of revenue and lost nearly $5 billion last year. And, that's sort of like baked into the valuation. So the people who are, determining whether it's worth, they merged with XAI in February, and the equity was valued at 1.25 trillion. They're now, supposedly going to be valued at as much as $2 trillion. So I imagine, the debt, weighed that down a little bit. Maybe the equity valuation would be even higher, but even with that debt load, we're still talking about a massively valuable business, at least from, the perspective of the investors who are counting on a lot of future growth and, hitting some pretty lofty targets.
Do you have a sense of which part of SpaceX is the most valuable? You mentioned the XAI acquisition. Obviously, there's the Starlink portion of the business, or is it just broadly valuable? How do you think about this?
Yeah, so when they merged with XAI, the combined entity was valued at 1.25 trillion, and they valued the SpaceX piece of it at $1 trillion, and then the XAI piece, which was the combination of that and Twitter, at 250 billion. So that's the smaller piece, but even at that, valuation, a lot of critics sort of viewed the merger as, a bailout, on the extreme of, the folks who invested in Twitter for $44 billion, which, Musk then tried to back out of. And, there was a lot of talk for a long time that he had way overpaid. So they've sort of now recouped their money and more, and that's turned into a very good investment. But the XAI and Twitter piece is still a relatively small piece of the business. Now I'm sure, AI will be a big piece of the growth story. And then yeah, both the rocket business and the Starlink are massive. I think the that Starlink is the more, profitable of the two at this point. But like the whole business and its crazy valuation is, based a lot on what's going to happen in the future. And it's, hard to predict. They're talking about like starting Mars colonies and stuff as crazy as that. So it's pretty sci-fi.
It's very futuristic and
Yeah.
maybe less futuristic and more near term. What do you think this filing, and again, it is an initial filing, you mentioned there will be amendments, but what does this do, if anything, for the potential IPOs for companies like OpenAI and Anthropic?
Yeah, no, I mean, I just think having an IPO as big as this sort of like get underway seems like it's gonna, open the floodgates. It seems like the IPO market has been pretty backed up for a while now, and we're seeing reports just in the last few days that, OpenAI is going to be filing for an IPO soon. I think Aura, the health technology company, there were reports today that they're, going to be moving to go public pretty quickly. So I think, yeah, seeing SpaceX go out the door is probably going to be beneficial for, all these companies that have just been sort of sitting and waiting for the conditions to be right to go public.
You mentioned at the top of this conversation that the filing allowed you and your colleagues on the wealth team to kind of refine what you knew about Musk's wealth.
Yeah.
Obviously, you have very in-depth reporting. You follow this all year round. But was there something that was most surprising to you or something that did cause you and the team to revise his valuation for his net worth?
Sure. Um, so we were, uh, I would say, glad to see that our estimates and our reporting related to Musk's wealth was pretty spot on. I would say, we had him with a stake of around 40% or so. And I think we, tweaked it to 41%. And so, um, yeah, we're still valuing it based on the deal they did in February. So that's at a 1.25 trillion valuation for the company. So he's worth like 830 billion, and about 500 billion of that is now his SpaceX stake. And if they do, uh, end up going public at a valuation of anywhere close to 2 trillion, he's almost certainly going to be the first trillionaire. I would say a new wrinkle is, we didn't have as much of a sense of he basically has this performance award that they gave to him recently, where I was talking about the Mars colony with 1 million people. That's like one of the conditions, and the other is, growing the company's market cap to $7.5 trillion, something crazy along those lines. And if he does that, he'll get all these other shares, which could boost his stake in the company from around 41% to nearly 50%. And interestingly enough, he already gets to vote those shares before he earns them. So he already has, majority voting control of the company. So you were talking about, the risk factors. And in addition to things like the debt, a lot of it has to do with just the immense amount of control that Musk has over the company. Like he basically can't get fired. He picks everyone on the board. He's in complete control. And like Tesla, like people are betting a large part on Musk. So yeah, that's another risk factor they talk about. If you were to leave for some reason at some point, like, you know, that's a big part of the business is just him being there and people betting on Musk.
That's a huge question. If he leaves, if he decides to do something else, what does that mean for SpaceX? What does it mean for Tesla? I think those are huge questions. But I'm glad you talked about his control and his power because earlier this week, it's been an interesting week for Musk. A jury unanimously rejected his $150 billion lawsuit against OpenAI. And before we were started recording, I said to you that feels like it was 10 years ago at this point. So does that rejected lawsuit mean anything for his power in Silicon Valley, or does this prospectus and does this potential trillionaire status maintain his power, basically? Does it not matter, the OpenAI
Yeah,
lawsuit?
yeah, that's a good question. It always seemed like he was asking for like $150 billion or something crazy from OpenAI, which he said he was going to give to charity or roll back into OpenAI's charitable arm. So he wasn't, I guess, technically asking for it for himself, but yeah, huge ask, obviously. And it always seemed, you know, a bit of a long shot to me at least. And so I wasn't, that surprised, I guess, to hear that, he didn't end up getting that. And, so therefore, didn't see it as, greatly diminishing his power. I don't think there's anyone, more powerful than him in Silicon Valley or really anywhere, probably other than maybe president and a few other elected officials. But no, I don't think it diminishes him too much. But, yeah, I mean, all the discovery that came out in that, it was a pretty ugly process that, dragged, Altman and Brockman and him too a little bit through the mud. And, I'd be curious to know, like, if that was worth it to him or if he regrets it. But I don't know. He's got a lot of things going on and probably isn't too tied up with it.
That he does, and maybe he agrees with his friend President Trump that all publicity is good publicity. I don't know.
Yeah.
That is just a supposition. But
Could be.
going back to some of the revelations in this prospectus, you have a story on Forbes.com right now talking about how there's a board member with a significant stake and is now a billionaire, or you can confirm is a billionaire. Can you talk about who this is and what it means?
Yeah. So it's Luke Nosek, who was a co-founder of PayPal. Him and Musk go way back to the late 90s, early 2000s. PayPal merged with a company that Musk founded, and then they sold it to eBay. And from there, he went on to found Founders Fund, the huge venture capital firm run by Peter Thiel, uh, and was there until 2017 when he started his own venture capital fund or another venture capital fund called GigaFund. And so he was one of SpaceX's earliest investors, and he's been on the board since 2008. The company was founded in 2002. And, we estimate he has a pretty small stake, like 0.2%, but, at a valuation of $1 trillion plus, that, adds up pretty quickly. So, yeah, based on that stake alone, we added him to our billionaires list with a $2.7 billion net worth. So yeah, that was one of the big revelations. And then there were a few more folks in there who are, billionaires or close to billionaires and likely will become billionaires if they achieve the valuation they're targeting.
I was going to say, I think or you've reported that his stake is double that of, I'm reading from your story now, Chief Operating
Mhm.
Officer Gwen Shotwell, who's on our list of the world's most powerful women.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the Chief Financial Officer. Anyone else joining the Billionaire Club based on yesterday's filing, or anyone else that you'll be watching going forward?
Yeah. Um, So yeah, Shotwell, her stake ended up being a little bit lower than we had thought. So she has about a 0.11% stake, still billionaire, about $1.3 billion worth that stake. And then the chief financial officer, Brett Johnson, is right on the edge and will likely become a billionaire when they go public. Um, Antonio Gracias, who is a longtime Musk ally and founded and runs Valor Equity Partners. The firm has like a $50 billion plus stake in SpaceX, and hard to tell at this point how much of that is ultimately, going to go back to him as opposed to his investors, but he's going to be one of the huge winners. And then there are a few others where, it was a surprise, I would say. Steve Jurvetson, another big name venture capitalist, is a director of SpaceX. And at least in this version of the prospectus, he showed up with no shares. I don't know if that's something that's going to get filled in at some point and give us, more information on how much he could be worth. And then there were some, big name venture capital firms that had been reported as having these giant stakes and didn't show up in the prospectus. And so I guess question of, whether they could show up in a later draft or, you know, if you're below 5%, you don't need to. And so maybe they could have like a 4.9% and it would still be massive and just never have to disclose it. So still some things we're gonna have to wait and see on.
A lot of forward reporting, but in the meantime, do we have a date for the IPO? Do we know the next steps here?
Yeah. So there's no firm date in the prospectus, but the reporting that's out there indicates it's going to be sometime next month, probably in the first half of the month. So things seem to be moving very quickly.
Moving very quickly. And as it moves, what's your biggest question going forward? What will you be asking sources?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Musk has talked a lot about allocating a larger than usual share of the, shares they'll be selling to the public to retail investors versus the institutional investors that usually get a big chunk of it. So that'll be interesting to see. I think Bill Ackman sort of did that with his the IPO of his fund recently, and that was talked about as potentially one of the reasons that, its initial trading was so volatile. So that'll be interesting. And then, yeah, of course, we we've been talking about for a long time how this, will likely make Musk, the first trillionaire, which be a huge milestone, for us and something that didn't seem remotely possible not too long ago.